free and warm and engaging recording for your podcast, consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of equity, energy, and empowerment with your co-host Victoria Cornelio and myself, Jensen Cummings.
Welcome, everybody.
Yeah, in today's episode, we discuss the Global South's energy shift. Can we balance development and decarbonization? We're going to be talking with our guest, Dr. Arya Atul.
Yeah, hi, everybody.
Dr. Arya, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Arya is Senior Vice President and Chief Energy Strategist with S&P Global. His areas of expertise include business strategy, commercial analysis, oil markets, energy technologies, climate change, and renewables. And Dr. Arya, we're going to be really talking a lot about One Planet, Two Realities, realizing energy transition in the Global South, something that you co-penned and I think brought just a lot of thoughts to the forefront for the Tangelic team. So can you touch on that article, give everybody just a quick snapshot so we can understand what we're talking about a little bit, then I'll have you give a little bit of your background.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jensen and Victoria, for having me on your podcast. By the way, please call me Atul, don't have to be very formal. I think the whole hypothesis behind the article is the reality that, there is so much talk about energy transition, but there is, billions of people in what we call global south or emerging markets and developing economies who are still, for them, energy transition is quite different. It's really about energy access and equity and being able to have, better livelihoods, which energy is very critical. So that was the idea behind the article, to compare and contrast and in a way define what energy transition really means for the billions of people who are currently without any energy or very little energy.
Can you give us a little bit of your background? I'm interested to hear obviously we heard some of your credentials, but for you, what puts you in a position to want to be writing articles like this, to want to be doing the work that you're doing?
Yeah. So I have spent my entire career in the energy industry, and actually I kind of was born in the energy industry. I was born in India, and my father built power stations, and they were all coal-fired thermal power stations, which is something we want to now get rid of around the world. So I kind of knew how energy changed the lives of people, very, very poor people. When you see light come in and you're kind of, your day becomes 24 hours rather than the 8 or 9 hours of daylight, that's hugely, very meaningful. And since then, I'm a petroleum engineer by training. I've worked in the oil and gas industry. I've run a solar company. And for the last dozen years or so, I've been with S&P and its predecessor companies. And in my role, I advise companies on many things related to energy and climate change, and with a big focus on kind of energy transition around the world, not just in the West, but also in the East, in Africa, in Asia, and Middle East, and so on. So that's what I do. I think more like an engineer, I would say, rather than an economist, because at the end of the day, I always remind my colleagues that the laws of thermodynamics have never changed, and they will not change no matter how you work. Yes.
That's great to hear. I think we need more people that can think across different disciplines. So I can very much appreciate that. I know Victoria is very interested to kind of have you help us, for our audience, for you, the definition of the global south. We've heard of the global south, the global north. We've heard of the west and the east, and we've heard of emerging markets. There's a lot of geopolitics tied into that. How do you view it? What is your kind of definition to help us understand where in the world we're actually talking about?
Yeah, very good question. And global south can sometimes be very misleading, and also many people don't like to use the term north and south. It's kind of some ways diminishes many people who live in those parts of the world. I was the phrase I like to use very simply is developed versus developing countries. Now, the World Bank uses a term called emerging markets and developing economies to really distinguish between sort of the middle income countries versus the low income, and we here in the US being in the high income countries. So I think that the focus of the work of this article in particular was really starting with the low income at the bottom of the pyramid, if you would, and then the middle income. But the global south, for example, there are countries who are currently in the definition. China is a global south. Saudi Arabia is a global south. So those are not poor countries. We know China is, of course, come out of poverty very well. So I would say the biggest focus is countries in Africa, pretty much all of Africa, in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then also many countries in Latin America. That's kind of the world I'm talking about.
All right, Victoria, time to get a little technical. Jump in here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Everything sounds very interesting. And reading through your article as well, some questions that I have right off the bat is you talk about some limitations in northern centric solutions and sort of that generalization. And like you just mentioned, sometimes energy is just access to energy that we're talking about, not so much, more technical things. So when it comes to inclusive climate policies, which ones or how can we make them better reflect the unique challenges and opportunities in the global south?
Yeah. So it's a really great question because we, and I count myself in that, having lived in the US for a long time now, or in the West, is that we think of solutions which we are used to, right? So we say, okay, well, EVs, electric vehicles are a big thing. Let's get a lot of EVs around the world. The reality is, for majority of the people in the world, they don't even have a motorcycle, or so getting to EVs is kind of like a total leapfrog. And also this idea that because we could go from landlines to cell phones, we can leapfrog technology. Energy doesn't really work that way. Yeah, we can leapfrog some things, but not everything. So one simple example I will give you of a solution for the developing world is around cooking, clean cooking, right? Cooking is such a huge part of everybody's life. And by the way, majority of the people in the poor countries, the women who collect the wood or collect the fuel to do the cooking, and then they're using open stoves and very inefficient way of cooking, and a lot of health effects of the smoke inhalation and everything else. Remember, many of that cooking is done inside a house or in a hut. So let's say that we try to get them to cleaner cooking. There are lots of ideas of cleaner cooking, but also LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which is high energy density, is much cleaner, and could be affordable or could be given with some kind of incentives. It improves the health quality, it saves a lot of time, and the livelihood of that family changes because now they have more time to do other more productive things rather than collect wood. Now, my colleagues on the environment will tell me, side will say, oh, by the way, that's oil, hydrocarbon. Why are we using that? But that's a solution we need, which is available, which is practical. Let's do that while we do other things. I'm a firm believer, having worked in the solar industry, that we should deploy as much of solar PV and wind wherever we can, onshore wind as much as possible. There's no it's not a question of I'm not debating that let's not do that or let's do that. So we need, but we need to be, the main point I want to make is we need to be pragmatic about the solutions. Even there are parts of the world, even today, and I was in South Africa about a month back, where in Africa, you can't put solar because there are logistical issues. You can't even put a village on solar because there are certain things you need. You need somebody to be able to maintain the system. You need to be able to see what's the best use of that energy. So let's think about the place where where we want to put the solution, and let's think sort of holistically rather than being very narrow-minded.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that really came across in the article when you were talking about how, when it comes to solutions and their limitation of this northern centric idea that we have that, well, this is how we do it here, so let's just go do it over there, right? It's not that easy, is it? And then the role that communities play when it comes to enacting these solutions and having the community involved. Because like you said, for example, maintaining solar panels isn't something that we go in as a solution thinking, oh, these communities are going to do it and they're going to pick it up, right? So when it comes to your work and your solutions, how do you involve communities into that conversation?
Yeah, so we work, as I said, we work around the world, and we work with our primary point of access is through companies, and companies are of course working with communities in which they operate. And just using a very recent example, in South Africa, I was at an event called Africa Energy Week, where there was a lot of discussion about not just hydrocarbons, but also about power and renewables. And I did a moderated a panel. I had one of the top regulators from South Africa who was there, and she was talking about how South Africa has a very big commitment to move away from coal. They have this thing called, you may be aware, called JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is a global effort to give money to South Africa was the first country, then Indonesia, Vietnam, and there are other countries in the line, the large coal consumers, India, to remove coal and replace it with renewables, right? So, and she is one of the regulators involved in it. So we had this discussion about how do you actually do this? Because, well, you say let's stop coal tomorrow, right? No more coal. It's not that straightforward because there are coal miners, there are transportation, there's a whole ecosystem. So you need to first of all figure out how you're going to redeploy them. Can they be redeployed to build renewable plants, or can they do something else? So you have to think about that and get them involved, and that's what they're doing. So we had ideas around how to retrain some of the people who are involved in it. There's a lot of pushback, right? If I'm a 60-year-old person, I'm not going to be I mean, let's be honest, right? I'm thinking about retirement or something else, and not spending time relearning something new. So how do you deal with those practical issues rather than just coming up from somewhere in Europe saying coal is bad, coal is bad? Not that straightforward. So that's one idea, one example of how do we engage, and we do a lot of work also, I should say, in Asia, including Southeast Asia and South Asia.
Yeah, no, I think that example perfectly highlights one of those conversations that I think your article really brought forward as well. Is again, we can't just generalize because we do it this way here. We can't just move that and move it over there, right? It's not a Lego house that we can just take and plug it somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, one other thing I would just want to expand on this and mention to you is that the issue of money, which we bring out in the article, right? We need money, and I always ask this kind of, I know it's a bit of a rhetorical question. See, if you had $1, your next dollar to spend on addressing climate change and energy, what is the best place to spend that extra dollar? Is it in the U.S.? Is it in Norway to buy a more new electric car, or is it in Africa to provide access to energy for somebody? By all analysis, the best value of that dollar is somewhere people have no energy. But we don't do that, and that's impractical because there are political considerations. U.S. is not going to, or Europe or rich countries, not going to give tons of money with no strings attached and all of that. But I think that's one of the other things we argue in the article, is that let's think more logistically, more kind of holistically, I should say, about how the money is spent. We're so wedded to this. Well, let's get more money. Now in the COP meeting which just happened, the big debate was around money. The new commitment is 300 billion from 100 billion. And my feeling is 300 billion was by 2035. So it's a bit of a kicking the can down the road because, there's no timeline to say how that amount increases over time. So I think that needs to increase very fast. And then also there needs to be some good thinking around how that money is going to be spent. Where should that money be spent?
Well, I think bringing in that example of COP, I believe the UN Trade and Development have predicted that it's meant to be 1.3 trillion really that we need. And when we move things to 2035, the big issue that we have is that as we get closer, the climate science becomes even more scary. So we don't have till 2035 to be figuring these things out, right? The loss and damages fund is one of the best examples that we've seen of all the bureaucracy around operationalizing and figuring out how we use money in this space, isn't it?
By the way, I agree with you. And on that point, one of the other things which we are, in my view, we are not paying, and we're going to do another publication in March. And the thing I want to argue in that is around adaptation, because climate change is here. I mean, we can debate the degrees of it, but we are seeing it everywhere. We are seeing the impact of it in very rich countries. Let's not forget what happened in the US, what happened in Spain this year. So it's everywhere, right? So the real question is, how do we not only mitigate but also adopt? And the poor countries, the ones we were talking about, the emerging markets, developing economy, they're the least equipped to address the impacts of climate change, and a lot more money needs to go. So the loss and damage you mentioned, Victoria, I think that was a good start. But again, I would argue, there are some kind of no-brainer things. We should be doing a lot more of those no-brainer things. It's good for all time. Spending money on adaptation is going to pay back. That's where people are safe, and then they can think about their livelihoods. So otherwise, think about all the migration. We are already seeing some of it, and all the migration we will see because of climate change.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of literature that talks about looking at climate change as a disaster and the way that we risk reduce and adapt to disasters, right? If we start seeing it or as a health crisis and things like that, all these mediums that we have already to prevent and adapt rather than looking at it as a thing of, oh God, what are we going to do?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And before we move on to the kind of the next topic, I did want to try and understand a little bit more as we're talking about the financial aspects of it. We're talking about the poorer countries. So we're talking about richer and poorer countries and the geopolitics therein. Financial responsibility, where do you feel that falls? For the West to fund because there's money in place? Or how do you see the financial responsibility and kind of the ownership of some of these types of projects?
Yeah. So I think that the challenge, Jensen, in my view, with some of these conversations is it's kind of very polar, right? It's like you guys, you're responsible. You better pay us. If you don't pay, we have no responsibility. I think it's a collective responsibility, first of all. So I'll give you one very specific example, right, which was in our article, is around capacity building. So we know that there is money which is already going to many of these countries. Is that money being well spent? I think in many cases it is, but could it be better spent? That's a good example of capacity building. So we need to think about how the money flows, where the money goes, and how it's being used, and is it really delivering the value it's supposed to deliver. We didn't touch on the article specifically, but the whole issue with carbon markets, and there was an agreement at COP also around so-called Article 6. But the carbon market has been, there have been big challenges around transparency of that. So you create these credits, and then they're being sold in banks in Europe or in elsewhere, making all this money, but the value of that is not going to the people whose credits they are, right? The people using cook stove as a good example, or forestry. So I think more money needs to flow from the richer countries who have resources to the countries which need the money, and it will need to be some combination of what I would call grant money, meaning it's a donation in a way, right? It's a money which you are not expecting to get back, but also loans, some favorable loans. I mean, one of the things we raise in the article is, the cost of borrowing, which comes up all the time. Why is the cost of borrowing in poor countries 2-3 times the cost of borrowing in the US or in Europe? And that basically, by the way, kills many projects, because a project developer looks at the cost of money and says, well, look, if I have this much money, I'd rather build another solar plant in the US than go to Africa, because it's a higher risk, higher cost, and I'm not getting the return I need. So that needs to come. And some of that is just sort of, because there is a risk premium to lack of capacity or lack of transparency, how the money will be spent. So those things are all addressable. It's not like we can't do that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think because we're on the topic of money and financing being a critical barrier for renewable energy products in the global south, what are some innovative financing mechanisms that could bridge this gap that you've maybe seen or about? Or I know you mentioned some in the article talking about financing schemes and mechanisms, things like that.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a lot of very interesting ideas being put forth around this whole financing. I should also say we briefly touch on it. It's very kind of project or technology specific, right? I think financing for solar and wind, in particular solar, is much easier. I mean, it's kind of already there. It's going to get easier because the costs have come down and there is a lot bigger market, let's say. Whereas financing for something more kind of still up in the development phase, like a CCS, carbon capture and storage, or hydrogen, is going to be very difficult. And again, my advice to the company have been that do the lowest hanging fruit first. Why do you want to tackle some very difficult technologies, which even we in the West are still wrestling with, right? Why go after, unless there is a very clear, good, solid project which has clear returns, is too much of a risk to carry. Let the richer companies and countries get the risk down, and then use that, once the technologies are developed, to implement those. But at present, I feel, particularly in the power sector, we have so much opportunity with both solar and wind they're no-brainer. And by the way, the other area which people are also talking about electric vehicles, but actually the bigger opportunity is in two-wheelers. Around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and Africa, two-wheelers are a lot more common, mainly because the infrastructure for cars is not there, and their two-wheelers are cheaper. And I'm sure you've seen photos of like a whole family piled up on a two-wheeler, right? Why don't we convert all of those two-wheelers to battery-powered two-wheelers, which is already happening, by the way, in places like India. You have batteries, and then so an innovative idea is these are swappable batteries, right? So you don't even have to charge, because many of these people are living in multi-story buildings, not easy to do charging. Is you just go to a service station rather than buying gasoline, petrol. You just take your discharge battery and get a new one with some cost. And if you just did that around the world, that will first of all be very good for air quality, and second, it'll be good for removing hydrocarbons, reducing the amount of hydrocarbons we're using, having addressed the climate change. And it's affordable. It requires some loans, particularly upfront cost of vehicle, but still, that's the kind of things I think we should be thinking about and talking more about. This again goes to think about the solution which is specific to the place where you're trying to put the solution.
Yeah, I think it's a very nice full circle there because every community will have its capabilities and capacities and things like that. And I think that example perfectly highlights a solution that is starting to be rolled out, but it's not being talked about as much because it's not something that the whole world, for example, looks at or can relate to when it comes to their own communities.
Yeah, we call it in our article, we call it horses for courses approach, right? Don't have a single magic bullet solution.
I'm interested, feet on the street, on the ground, say a country like Ghana, which I know Tangelic is going to be doing some outreach and support in. How do I get involved? How do I make a change in my community? How do I find a voice? And how do I find some of this money to be able to implement some change in my community? A lot of times it feels like these communities are getting that forced upon them, as you mentioned. And how do they kind of own their own journey and their own ability to put themselves in a better energy position?
So, in many of the countries, both in Africa and Asia, the energy business is run by the state-owned companies, is state-owned oil or state-owned power companies. There is more privatization happening, but still, I would say in various stages of, some countries have privatized significantly, others have not. So I think it sort of depends upon where you are. I'm not very familiar with what's happening in Ghana, but I'll give you another example of a country in Africa with critical minerals, which is a similar issue. Africa has a huge amount of minerals which will be needed for the transition batteries and other like magnets and so on. In this place, what they are doing is there is this regulation for making sure that the mining companies are following kind of the environmental standards, right? And but who is going to monitor that? Who is going to police that? So what they have done is they have engaged the local communities, the villages and the heads of the villages, to train them on what sustainability standards are. Because the mines are there, they know, they can see themselves, they can see with their eyes what's going on, and then they have a way to report both the good things which are happening and not so good things which are happening. So that's how the community is now part of the whole process. Another example from the same country is that they need workers, right, for these mines. So they are getting communities involved to train people. We have in this article is the capacity building in terms of really technology and skilled workforce. So there is a huge opportunity for the communities to come together and get their people. There are a lot of young people in many of these countries we're talking about, in Africa, for example, in Asia, and that the young workforce is getting more skilled. They all have a mobile phone, so they know how to use technology. But can they get trained in using more energy related technologies? Can they in deploying those technologies? So for example, building solar farms or putting up wind turbines or even developing hydrocarbon resources or mining. There will be no shortage of opportunities. I think this is the governments with the communities coming together and figuring out what the needs are, then making sure that those needs can be met.
For sure. And I think touching on that, when it comes to all the opportunities that bring in these new technologies can bring, so job creation and more skilled workforces and things like that, the global south does face a challenge when it comes to balancing poverty alleviation, economic growth, and then on top of that, decarbonization. So, how can these competing priorities be reconciled in practical terms?
Yeah. So you see, the thing we all know is that energy kind of is the lifeblood of the modern economy, right? Without energy, pretty much nothing. I mean, think about it. We are talking online and on the internet, powered by electricity, right? You have a cell phone in the smallest villages, in the poorest countries, pretty much everybody, because they're so cheap. But they are being powered by a battery, which gets charged by electricity. So energy is in a way, in my mind, what I call a heat, light, and mobility, heat and cool, is most critical. So I think the answer to your question, Victoria, is that I have seen, and we have seen this, and actually the development banks like World Bank know this very well. When you bring energy to people, then they can do a lot more things, right, with that energy. Not just light their home or have their children have ability to study in night and learn, but also do more economic activities. Many years ago now, we were working in Philippines and Indonesia, where there are a lot of islands. So Philippines and Indonesia are a great case study for distributed energy because there's so many islands and so many people. Building a large power plant kind of makes no sense. So you have to have distribute, either it's a small solar farm or a wind turbine. But when you bring that energy to those people, they can create new industries for themselves. It could be, they're building some cottage industries or a textile manufacturing or some indigenous industry, which then can be linked to either domestic market or export markets. One of the big areas right now, actually, we are looking at is, if you're going to really do energy transition the way we are talking, we're going to need a lot of minerals. You're going to need a lot of minerals. You're going to need a lot of energy to extract those minerals. Where is that energy going to come from? Can that be renewable energy? The good news is in places in Africa in particular, is a lot of hydro energy available. So could we use hydropower to do that? Or natural gas, but the problem is you have natural gas in one country, for example, here in Africa, in Namibia, but it's too much. So can you create a regional grid which can then use that and transmit that to other places via electricity? So I think those are the kind of things which will bring more development to the local communities. So energy so critical, right? We take it for granted. Like we turn the switch on and it's the light is there, or we turn our car on and it's got gasoline in it. Think about the lifestyle we have versus the lifestyle many of these countries have. And think about the GDP. We put this in the article. GDP for U.S. versus or Europe versus developing countries, it could be 150th, 100th. I mean, they are at the very beginning of the development, and why are they so far down? Because they don't have access to the basics of life, whether it's energy, clean air, clean water, all healthcare, all of those things. But the underlying all of that, by the way, is energy now, right? You can't build a hospital without having power. You can't build a plant of any kind, any industry without having energy. So that's why building, creating that infrastructure, hugely, hugely important.
For sure, that's very thought provoking. Thank you.
Yeah, very much so. Dr. Arya, Atul, this was an amazing conversation for everybody watching, for everybody listening. Make sure and go check out the full blog post because we're going to end this episode. But Victoria and Dr. Arya are going to geek out a little bit more and give us a little bit more intel, a little more information. So you have exclusive content over on the blog post. You'll be able to see some more questions, maybe some more technical answers. We'll probably share some resources there for you as well. But this has been an amazing conversation. Dr. Arya, really appreciate the work that you're doing. Really appreciate the way that you're explaining everything because these are complex issues, complex projects. We made it feel very relatable and very attainable, which we need to have that opportunity in these projects. So everybody, once again, this is Tangelic Talks. We were talking about the energy shift in the global south with Dr. Atul Arya with S&P Global. Appreciate you all for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic talks energy, equity, pride, empowering the world side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.